There's still someone inside. The words cut through the night like a blade, sharp enough to freeze the crowd where they stood, sharp enough to rise above the wailing sirens and the low roar of fire swallowing wood and glass, and for a moment the entire street seemed to hold its breath as flames climbed higher along the three-story mansion, licking the white columns that only hours ago had gleamed under soft golden lights, now turning them into silhouettes against a sky painted orange and black, smoke curling thick and heavy into the cold air while neighbors stood scattered across the sidewalk in pajamas and coats, phones clutched in trembling hands, their faces lit not by screens but by the violent flicker of burning windows, and no one moved, not toward the front door, not toward the heat, not toward the sound that came again, faint but unmistakable, a child's voice somewhere deep inside calling for help, barely louder than a whisper yet somehow louder than everything else, louder than the siren's still blocks away, louder than the crackling beams giving way one by one, louder than the pounding in Aaliyah Brooks's chest as she stood at the edge of the crowd with her thin jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold, her sneakers damp from melted snow, her eyes locked on the second-floor window where a curtain flapped weakly in the heat like it was trying to escape, and beside her a man muttered, "Fire department's on the way," as if saying it enough times could make it happen faster, as if waiting was a plan, as if waiting meant safety, but Aaliyah didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone, because all she could see was that window and all she could hear was that voice, and across the street black SUVs screeched to a halt, doors flying open as security stepped out first, followed by a tall man in a dark overcoat whose presence seemed to shift the air itself, Jonathan Hale, a name people recognized even before they saw his face, a man used to control, to decisions, to rooms falling silent when he spoke, and yet now he stood still at the edge of the chaos, his eyes fixed on the burning structure that had been his home, his jaw tight, his phone pressed to his ear as he demanded updates that didn't come fast enough, and someone rushed to him, speaking quickly, urgently, but whatever they said seemed to dissolve before it reached him because then it came again, that sound, thinner now, strained, "Dad," and the words seemed to break something invisible, something no one could quite name, because suddenly the silence of the crowd wasn't just fear, it was helplessness, it was the realization that all the money, all the power, all the presence in the world could not step through that door without risking everything, and still no one moved, not the neighbors, not the security team, not even the man who owned the burning house, and that was when Aaliyah took a step forward, just one, small and almost unnoticed, but it carried a weight that shifted the moment, her hands unclenching at her sides as her eyes narrowed against the heat, and someone reached out instinctively, brushing her sleeve, "Hey, don't." But she pulled free without looking back, her voice low but steady, almost lost under the crackle of the fire. "If no one goes, he dies," and there was no anger in it, no drama, just a simple truth that landed heavier than any shout could, and for the first time Jonathan Hale turned, really turned, his gaze finding her in the crowd, taking in the worn edges of her clothes, the steadiness in her posture, the way she didn't look at him like everyone else did, not with recognition, not with expectation, just with purpose, and something flickered in his expression, something uncertain, something human, but before it could become anything more, Aaliyah was already moving, her feet carrying her past the line where the heat became unbearable, past the murmurs rising behind her, past the unspoken rule that said wait, that said don't, that said someone else will handle it, and as she reached the front steps the flames reflected in her eyes, bright and unflinching, the door half collapsed inward, the air inside glowing with a dangerous, shifting light, and for a single suspended second the world seemed to narrow to just that doorway and the girl standing before it, the sound of her breathing, the distant sirens finally drawing closer, the crackle of wood bending under pressure, and then she stepped inside, and the fire swallowed her silhouette whole. The heat closed in the second she crossed the threshold, not as a sudden force but as something alive, something that wrapped around her lungs and pressed against her skin, thick and heavy, carrying the sharp scent of burning wood and something sweeter she could not name, and for a split second her body reacted before her mind did, her breath catching, her eyes narrowing against the shifting glow that turned every surface into shadow and flame at once, but she did not stop, she lowered herself instinctively, one hand brushing along the floor to steady her Movement as she moved forward inch by inch, the sound of the outside world fading behind her until there was only the crackle and the distant echo of something falling somewhere deeper in the house, and then she heard it again, weaker now, a small voice calling out through the haze, and it cut through everything, guiding her like a thread she refused to lose. "I am coming," she said, her voice steady even as it barely carried more for herself than for anyone else, and she kept moving, past a hallway where the walls glowed with a dull orange pulse, past a staircase where one side had begun to give way, forcing her to shift direction, her movements careful but urgent, each step chosen with instinct rather than thought, and outside the front door the crowd had begun to stir, murmurs rising, disbelief turning into something sharper, someone shouting that a girl had gone in, someone else trying to explain it, but no explanation felt large enough to match what they had just seen, and Jonathan Hale stood at the edge of it all, his phone lowered now, forgotten in his hand as his eyes fixed on the doorway that swallowed her, the space where she had disappeared, and for the first time since he arrived his voice failed him, because there was no command to give, no system to control, only the reality that someone he did not know had done what he had not, and the thought settled into him like something cold and immovable, while inside Aaliyah reached the base of the stairs and paused, not from hesitation but from calculation, the path upward partially blocked, the railing hot to the touch even from inches away, the air shifting in waves that made it hard to see clearly, but the voice had come from above, she was certain of it, and she adjusted her path, stepping onto the first intact section of the staircase, her weight careful, testing before committing, one step, then another, the sound beneath her feet creaking in protest but holding, and she moved quickly now, her breathing measured, shallow, conserving what she could as she reached the second floor, where the air felt even heavier, the hallway longer than it should have been, stretching out through the haze. And she called again, louder this time, "Hey, can you hear me?" And for a moment there was nothing, just the hum of heat and the distant groan of the structure shifting, and then, faint but real, "Here," and the word pulled her forward, step by step, until she saw him, a small figure near the end of the hall, partially hidden behind a fallen piece of furniture, his silhouette barely visible through the drifting smoke, and he was not moving much, just enough to let her know he was still there, still waiting, and something in her chest tightened, not fear, not exactly, but recognition of the moment, of what it meant, and she closed the distance between them, dropping to her knees beside him, her voice soft now, steady, "I got you," and his eyes found hers through the haze, wide and uncertain but holding on to that voice as if it was the only solid thing left, and behind her, far below, the first wail of approaching fire trucks finally broke through the night, growing louder with each passing second, but inside the house time felt different. Slower and faster all at once, because now it was not about getting in, it was about getting out, and Aaliyah shifted her weight, glancing back toward the hallway she had come from, already planning the path before she moved, already knowing there would be no waiting, no second guessing, only the next step and the one after that, because the moment she chose to enter had already decided everything that followed. The boy's hand trembled in hers, small and unsteady, his fingers tightening just enough to show he understood she was there, that he was no longer alone, and Aaliyah leaned closer, her voice calm and low as if the world around them had quieted instead of roared, "We are getting out of here, okay, you stay with me," and he nodded, a fragile movement that carried more trust than words ever could, and she quickly pulled the sleeve of her jacket over her hand before guiding it gently across his face to shield him from the thick air, adjusting her position so she could lift him without rushing, without panic, because panic would cost them time they did not have, and as she shifted her weight and brought him against her side, she felt how light he was, how still, and something deep inside her steadied even further, sharpening her focus, because now there was no room for hesitation, only direction, only action, and she turned back toward the hallway, her eyes scanning through the shifting haze, mapping the path she had memorized seconds earlier, the doorway, the turn, the staircase that had already begun to weaken, and she moved, one step at a time, careful and deliberate, keeping low as she guided him with her arm firm around his shoulders, her other hand trailing along the wall for balance, and behind them the faint sound of something giving way echoed through the structure, not close, but close enough to remind her that everything here was changing second by second, and outside the house the fire engines had arrived in a rush of motion and noise, red lights cutting across the street in sharp pulses, firefighters jumping into action with practiced urgency, pulling hoses, shouting directions, but even as they moved their eyes kept returning to the front door, to the knowledge that someone was still inside, and Jonathan Hale stood among them, his composure unraveling in ways no one had ever seen, his gaze fixed, unblinking, as if willing the house itself to give them back what it had taken, and when one of the firefighters tried to guide him back he barely registered it, his voice hoarse as he said, "My son is in there," and the words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke that drifted outward, because now everyone knew exactly what was at stake. And inside Aaliyah reached the top of the staircase again and paused just long enough to assess, the steps below no longer as solid as before, the railing shifting slightly as if warning her not to trust it, and she adjusted without thinking, lowering herself further, guiding the boy's arm over her shoulder so she could support more of his weight. "Stay with me," she whispered again. And then she began the descent, each step chosen carefully, her foot testing before committing, her balance shifting with precision, the heat rising in waves that made the air shimmer, but she did not look down, did not let herself focus on anything except the next step, and the next, and the next, until at last the staircase ended and the first floor opened in front of them again, the doorway now visible through the haze like a distant frame of light, and for the first time since she entered. She allowed herself to believe they might make it, but the distance still stretched, still uncertain, and she tightened her hold, her voice steady despite the strain, almost there, and the boy's head moved slightly against her shoulder, just enough to tell her he heard, just enough to keep her going, and outside the crowd had fallen into a tense silence broken only by the rush of hoses and shouted commands, every eye fixed on that doorway, every second stretching longer than the last, until finally, through the shifting smoke, a shape began to form, small at first, barely visible, but moving, coming closer, and someone gasped, the sound spreading through the crowd like a ripple, because it was not just anyone, it was her, and she was not alone. The moment she crossed the threshold, the night air hit her like something unreal, cold and sharp against the heat she had just left behind, and for a second her legs faltered not from fear but from the sudden shift, from the way the world outside rushed back all at once with sirens and voices and flashing lights, and then the noise broke open as the crowd surged forward, gasps turning into shouts, someone yelling that she made it, someone else calling for medics, and Aaliyah did not stop, did not slow. She kept moving until she was far enough from the doorway that the heat no longer pressed against her back, and only then did she lower herself carefully to one knee, guiding the boy down with a steadiness that came from instinct rather than thought, her hands firm but gentle as she kept him upright, her voice still calm despite the rush around them. "You are okay, you are safe now." And the words seemed to settle over him even before anyone else reached them, and then they were there, paramedics kneeling, voices quick but controlled, hands moving with purpose as they took over, and for the first time since she had stepped inside, Aaliyah let her shoulders drop slightly, not fully, just enough to release the tension she had been holding, and she leaned back a fraction, giving space, her breathing still measured as if she had not yet allowed herself to feel anything beyond the next moment. And that was when Jonathan Hale broke through the line of people, his composure gone, replaced by something raw and unfiltered as he dropped to his knees beside his son, his voice catching as he said his name, again and again, as if saying it could anchor him, could bring him fully back, and the boy's eyes shifted, unfocused but searching, and when they landed on his father something in his expression softened, something fragile but real, and Jonathan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his hand hovering before finally resting lightly on his son's shoulder, careful, almost hesitant, as if afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast, and around them the world continued in motion, firefighters moving past, hoses stretching across the pavement, commands being called out as the flames were finally met with force, but for Jonathan none of that existed, not the house, not the crowd, only the child in front of him and the fact that he was still here, and then, slowly, as if drawn by something he could not ignore, his gaze lifted, searching, until it found her, just a few feet away, still kneeling on the pavement, her jacket darkened by ash, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture quiet, almost unnoticed now that the immediate crisis had shifted, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, no words, no introductions, just the weight of what had just happened passing silently between them, and Jonathan's expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to show that something inside him had shifted, something that had nothing to do with control or power, something that had everything to do with understanding, and he stood then, slowly, as if the movement itself required thought, and took a step toward her, the noise of the crowd dimming in comparison to the space between them, and when he stopped in front of her there was a pause, brief but heavy, before he spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of everything it usually carried. "You went in there," and it was not a question, not exactly, more like a realization spoken out loud, and Aaliyah looked up at him, her expression steady, unchanged, and she nodded once, a simple movement, nothing more, and he exhaled, the sound uneven, as if he was still catching up to the moment. "That was my son," he said, and the words seemed to land differently this time. Not as a declaration but as something closer to gratitude, to disbelief, and she held his gaze for a second longer before answering, her voice quiet but clear. He called out, and that was all, no explanation, no emphasis, just the truth as she saw it, and Jonathan stood there, absorbing it, the simplicity of it, the weight of it, and for the first time in a long time, he had nothing to add, nothing to negotiate, nothing to control, only the undeniable fact that the person who had saved his son was standing in front of him, not asking for anything, not expecting anything, just present, and behind him someone called his name, urgent, pulling him back toward the reality of what still needed to be handled, but he did not move right away, his eyes still on her, as if he understood, even in that moment, that whatever came next would not be the same as what came before. The moment stretched just long enough to feel fragile, like something that could break if either of them said the wrong thing, and then the noise of the world returned in full force as a paramedic called out for space, guiding Jonathan back toward the ambulance where his son was being lifted carefully onto a stretcher, and he hesitated, just for a second, his eyes still on Aaliyah as if leaving that spot meant losing something he had not yet understood, but then instinct pulled him back to his child, his steps quick and uneven as he followed, his hand reaching out again, not to control, not to direct, but simply to stay close, and Aaliyah remained where she was, her gaze following the movement without attachment, without expectation, as the stretcher doors closed and the ambulance lights reflected across her face in brief flashes of red and white. And the vehicle pulled away with a rising siren that cut through the night and disappeared down the street, taking with it the center of everyone's attention, the urgency shifting from the burning house to the road ahead, and just like that the space around her began to empty, not completely, but enough that the noise softened, the focus drifting elsewhere, and the firefighters continued their work with steady precision. Water arcing into the structure as smoke billowed upward, thicker now but less violent, and neighbors spoke in hushed voices, some still glancing at her, some whispering, unsure of what to say or whether to say anything at all, and Aaliyah slowly pushed herself to her feet, her movements deliberate, as if her body was catching up to what it had just done, her knees stiff, her shoulders heavy, and she brushed her hands lightly against her jacket, more out of habit than necessity, before taking a small step back from the scene, not toward the center of attention but away from it, toward the edges where she had started, where she felt most familiar, and no one stopped her, no one called out, because the moment had already shifted in their minds from action to aftermath, and she moved quietly along the sidewalk, her gaze lowering as the brightness of the emergency lights faded behind her, replaced by the dim glow of street lamps that cast long shadows across the pavement, and her breathing slowed, steady again, matching the rhythm of her steps, one after another, until the noise of the scene became distant, just another sound in the city night, and she reached the corner where the street turned, where the view of the house disappeared entirely, and she paused there for a second, not looking back, just standing still as if confirming something to herself, and then she kept walking, her pace unhurried, her figure blending into the quiet that existed just beyond the chaos. And across town the ambulance doors burst open as it arrived at the hospital entrance, medical staff already waiting, moving quickly but calmly as they guided the stretcher inside, and Jonathan followed close behind, his steps matching theirs without thinking, his focus fixed entirely on his son, on the rise and fall of his chest, on the reassurance spoken in clinical tones that he tried to hold on to, and when they disappeared through the double doors he stopped, just short of crossing that threshold, as if the momentum that had carried him there finally paused, and he stood in the bright sterile light of the hospital entrance, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beside him, and for the first time since the fire, the silence around him was complete, no sirens, no shouting, only the distant hum of the building and the echo of his own breathing. And that was when it came back to him, not the flames, not the fear, but the image of her, standing there in the aftermath, saying so little and yet changing everything, and he turned slightly, looking back toward the street as if she might still be there, as if the moment had not already passed, and something unfamiliar settled into his chest, not relief, not exactly, but something heavier, something that did not fade with distance, because for the first time in a long time, he realized that the most important moment of his life had been placed in the hands of someone he did not know, someone who had asked for nothing in return, and the weight of that realization stayed with him as the hospital doors slid closed behind him, sealing the night on one side and leaving him standing on the other, already changed in ways he could not yet explain. The hospital corridor felt too bright, too still, as if it belonged to a different world entirely, one untouched by smoke or fear, and Jonathan Hale stood just outside the room where his son had been taken, his hands resting at his sides but not relaxed, his fingers curling slightly as if holding on to something invisible, something he could not yet name, and through the small glass panel he could see movement. Doctors and nurses working with quiet efficiency, their voices low and steady, and he watched every motion as if understanding each detail might somehow give him control over the outcome, but control was gone now, replaced by waiting, and waiting was something he had never been good at, not in business, not in life, and certainly not now, and minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretching out in ways that made time uncertain, until finally the door opened and a doctor stepped out, her expression calm, composed. And Jonathan straightened immediately, his voice catching just slightly as he asked, "Is he okay?" And she nodded once, a small but definitive gesture. "He is stable, he is going to be all right," and the words landed slowly, as if they needed time to settle, and Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling a breath that carried more weight than anything he had said that night, and when he opened them again something in his posture had shifted, not entirely, but enough to show the tension had eased, replaced by something quieter, something deeper, and the doctor continued, explaining what would come next, rest, observation, time, but Jonathan heard only parts of it, because his mind had already moved somewhere else, back to the street, back to the fire, back to her, and without realizing it he asked, "The girl," and the doctor paused slightly, as if searching her memory, "I am not sure who you mean," and he hesitated, realizing how little he actually knew, no name, no details, only an image and a moment that refused to leave him, and he nodded. Slowly, "It is fine," he said, though it was not really, and the doctor gave a polite smile before moving on, leaving him alone again in the corridor, and he turned back toward the window, looking in at his son now resting, the urgency replaced by quiet machines and soft lighting, and he watched him for a long moment, taking in the steady rise and fall of his chest, the calm that had replaced chaos. And yet even in that calm something felt incomplete, something unresolved, and he stepped back from the door, his gaze shifting down the empty hallway as if expecting something to appear, as if the answer might be waiting just out of sight, and across the city Aaliyah Brooks walked without direction, her path guided more by habit than intention, her steps carrying her through streets that had long since quieted, past closed storefronts and dim streetlights that flickered faintly in the early hours, and her shoulders had relaxed now, the tension of the night fading into a dull heaviness, her breathing even, her expression neutral, as if what had happened was already being placed somewhere distant in her mind, not forgotten, but not held on to either, and she reached the underpass where she often stayed, the familiar sound of distant traffic echoing overhead, the concrete cool beneath her feet as she stepped into the shadowed space, and she lowered herself onto a worn piece of cardboard tucked against the wall, pulling her jacket tighter around her as the night air settled back into her bones, and for a moment she sat still, her gaze unfocused, listening to the quiet, and then she leaned back slightly, resting her head against the rough surface behind her, her eyes closing not in exhaustion alone but in acceptance, as if the night had taken what it needed and left her with what remained, and miles away Jonathan Hale stood in a place of comfort and certainty, surrounded by polished floors and controlled environments, yet feeling something unfamiliar, something unsettled, because for all the power he held, for all the resources at his command, the one thing that mattered most in that moment had been beyond his reach, placed instead in the hands of someone who walked now through a world entirely different from his own, and the distance between those two realities felt larger than ever before, not measured in miles or wealth, but in something far more difficult to define, something that lingered in his thoughts as he turned once more toward the room, knowing that while his son had been saved, the story of that night was far from over, because there was still one question he could not ignore, not anymore, not after what he had seen, and that question stayed with him long after the corridor fell silent again. Morning arrived slowly, not with sunlight but with the soft hum of machines and the distant rhythm of footsteps echoing through the hospital floor, and Jonathan Hale had not moved far from the chair beside his son's bed, his posture still, his eyes tracing the same quiet pattern of breathing that reassured him more than any words could, and for hours he had sat there, saying little, doing even less. Because for once there was nothing to manage, nothing to fix, only presence, only the realization that being there mattered more than anything he could delegate, and when his son stirred slightly, his fingers shifting against the blanket, Jonathan leaned forward immediately, his voice low, careful, "Hey, I am right here," and the boy's eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light, searching before settling on his father's face, and in that moment something passed between them, something unspoken, but understood, a quiet recognition that felt different from before, softer, more fragile, and the boy's voice came out faint but clear, "The girl," and Jonathan stilled, just for a second, because even now, even after everything, that was the first thing his son said, not the fire, not the fear, but her, and he nodded slowly, his expression tightening with something he could not quite hide. "Yeah," he said. His voice steady but quieter than usual, "She got you out," and the boy's gaze drifted slightly, as if replaying the memory, and then he whispered, "She said I was going to be okay," and Jonathan swallowed, the simplicity of that sentence hitting harder than anything else, because it was not just what she did, it was what she gave in that moment, something he had not been there to provide, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he processed it, and after a moment he asked, almost to himself, "Did she tell you her name?" And the boy shook his head faintly, "No." And that single word settled into the space between them, heavier than expected, because it meant that everything about her remained unknown, everything except the impact she had left behind, and Jonathan stood then, slowly, his decision forming not as a sudden realization but as something inevitable, something that had been building since the moment he saw her walk into the fire, and he stepped toward the door, pausing only long enough to glance back, his voice steady now, more certain, "I am going to find her," and the boy nodded, his eyes already drifting closed again, trusting in a way that felt new, and Jonathan stepped out into the hallway, the familiar world of polished floors and quiet order stretching out in front of him, but it no longer felt the same, no longer felt complete, and within minutes his phone was in his hand again, not for business, not for deals or decisions, but for something else entirely, and his voice carried down the line with a clarity that left no room for delay. "I need everything from last night, security footage, street cameras, anyone who was there, find her," and there was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable, because this was not the kind of request he usually made, and then a response, quick, efficient, already moving into action, and Jonathan ended the call without another word, his gaze lifting as he walked, his pace steady, purposeful, and across the city, beneath the concrete shadow of the overpass, Aaliyah Brooks shifted slightly as the sound of early traffic grew louder overhead, her eyes opening to the gray light filtering in from the street beyond, and for a moment she remained still, her mind quiet, her body slow to follow, as if the world was giving her time to return to it, and then she sat up, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders as the cool morning air settled in, and she glanced down the street without expectation, without urgency, because for her the day was no different from any other, another stretch of hours to move through, another series of small decisions to get by, and she stood, brushing off the dust from her clothes, her movement simple, routine, and as she stepped out from beneath the overpass, blending into the early flow of the city, she did not look back. Did not consider the night before as something that would follow her, because for her it had already become part of the past, something done and left behind, and yet miles away, in a world she had already walked away from, her presence remained, not as a memory fading but as something growing stronger with each passing moment, something that refused to be ignored, because for Jonathan Hale, the night had not ended, not really, it had only begun a different kind of story, one that he was no longer willing to leave unfinished. By midday the city had returned to its usual rhythm, cars moving in steady lines, people passing each other without notice, and yet in a quiet office several floors above the street, that rhythm had been interrupted, screens lit with paused footage, timestamps blinking in the corner as moments from the night before replayed again and again, and Jonathan Hale stood in front of them, his posture still, his attention fixed in a way that made the room feel smaller, more focused, as if everything beyond those images had temporarily lost importance, and one of his analysts spoke carefully, pointing to a grainy frame. "This is her, right here, entering from the south side of the block," and the video showed it clearly now, Aaliyah stepping through the crowd, her figure partially obscured at first but unmistakable once she moved closer to the flames, and Jonathan watched without blinking, seeing it again, not as a blur of memory but as something undeniable, something real, and the analyst continued, shifting to another angle, "She leaves here, about 12 minutes later, heading east," and the screen changed, showing her walking away from the scene, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had not just done something most people would never attempt. And Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm, "Follow that," and fingers moved quickly across keyboards, pulling up additional cameras, stitching together fragments of her path across the city, and with each new angle the distance between their worlds became more defined, from wide streets to narrower ones, from lit storefronts to quieter corners, until finally the footage slowed, paused on a frame where she disappeared beneath the shadow of an overpass, and the room fell silent for a moment, because even without words the contrast was clear, and Jonathan exhaled slowly, straightening as he processed what he was seeing, and for a second no one spoke, unsure if the information was enough, unsure what he would say next, and then he turned slightly, his gaze moving from the screen to the people around him. "Send someone," he said, the instructions simple but carrying weight, and there was no hesitation in the response, no delay, because this was not a suggestion, it was a decision, and within minutes arrangements were already in motion, vehicles assigned, directions given, and Jonathan remained where he was, his eyes returning once more to the paused image of her walking away, her figure small against the frame yet somehow the only thing that mattered, and across the city Aaliyah moved through her day with the same quiet rhythm she always had, stopping briefly at a small convenience store where she exchanged a few coins for a bottle of water, nodding once to the cashier who barely looked up, and then continuing on, her path leading her toward a public park where she could sit for a while, where the noise of traffic softened into something more distant, and she found a bench near the edge, its paint worn, its surface uneven, and she sat down without ceremony, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she watched people pass by, children running across the grass, a man walking his dog, the ordinary movement of lives that had not been interrupted by fire or fear, and she did not search for anything in those moments, did not expect anything, because for her the world had always moved like this, one moment into the next without pause, and she leaned back slightly, her eyes lifting toward the sky as if measuring the time by the way the light shifted, and somewhere not far away a black SUV turned onto the street, its presence subtle but deliberate. Slowing as it approached the area, the driver scanning the surroundings with quiet attention, and inside the vehicle a man checked the address again, confirming the location, his instructions clear, his task simple, find her, and as the car came to a stop near the park, the engine idling softly, he stepped out, his gaze moving across the benches, across the people, until it settled, not on someone who stood out, but on someone who did not try to, and for a brief moment he hesitated, as if confirming what he already knew, and then he began to walk toward her, while miles away, in a room filled with screens and silence, Jonathan Hale stood alone, watching the same frame once more, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the next move in his life would not be made from a position of power, but from something far less familiar, something that required him to step into a world he had never truly seen before. The man approached without rushing, his steps measured in a way that suggested intention rather than urgency, and Aaliyah noticed him before he spoke, not because he stood out but because he did not belong to the quiet rhythm of the park, his posture too precise, his gaze too focused, and she lifted her eyes slightly, watching him the same way she watched everything else, without reaction, without assumption, and when he stopped a few feet in front of her there was a brief pause, just long enough for both of them to understand that this was not a coincidence, and then he spoke, his voice polite but direct, "Aaliyah Brooks," and her expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened, not fear, not surprise, just awareness, and she tilted her head slightly. "Who is asking?" And the man nodded once, as if expecting the question. "My name is Daniel, I work for Jonathan Hale," and the name landed in the space between them, recognizable even if it carried no weight for her in the way it did for others, and she held his gaze for a moment before looking away briefly, her attention shifting back to the park as if measuring whether this conversation mattered enough to continue, and then she said, simply, "Okay." And Daniel hesitated, just slightly, because that was not the reaction he was used to, not the curiosity, not the urgency, just acknowledgement, and he continued, adjusting his tone without realizing it. "He asked me to find you," and she let out a quiet breath through her nose, not impatience, not interest, just acceptance of the information, and she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "You found me," she said, her voice even, and Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes, I did." And for a second neither of them spoke, the sounds of the park filling the space instead, children laughing somewhere in the distance, leaves shifting in the breeze, the ordinary continuing without interruption, and then he added, "He would like to meet you," and that was the moment the conversation shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough that Aaliyah looked back at him fully now, her eyes steady, searching not for meaning but for intention, and she studied him in silence, as if deciding whether his words carried anything beyond themselves, and finally she asked, "Why?" And the question was not defensive, not curious, just direct, and Daniel paused, because he had expected that question but not the way she asked it, not without urgency or expectation, and he answered carefully, "Because of what you did last night," and she leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting away again, her attention returning to the movement of the park, and for a moment it seemed like she might not respond at all, and when she did her voice was quiet, almost distant. "I already did it," and Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it, and he stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade her space but enough to show that this mattered. "He understands that," he said, "but he still wants to thank you," and she shook her head once, a small movement, barely noticeable. "I do not need that," and the words were not harsh, not dismissive, just true, and Daniel hesitated again, because this was not how these conversations usually went, not with people who had just done something extraordinary, not with people who were being sought out by someone like Jonathan Hale, and he tried again, his tone softer now, less formal. "It is not just about thanks," and she looked at him again, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in focus, and he added, "He believes there is more to this," and for the first time there was a shift in her expression, subtle but real, a flicker of something that could have been curiosity or could have been nothing at all, and she sat in silence for a moment longer, letting the words settle, letting the weight of them pass through her without resistance, and then she stood, slowly, her movements deliberate, and Daniel straightened instinctively, unsure of what she would say next, and she looked at him, her voice steady, "I am not hard to find," and he nodded, unsure how to interpret that, and she stepped past him, not away but forward, as if continuing something rather than ending it, and after a second he turned to follow, falling into step beside her, not leading, not directing, just walking, and in that quiet movement something shifted again, not in the world around them but in the space between them, because for the first time since the night before, the distance between two completely different lives had begun to close. Not with force, not with urgency, but with a simple decision to move in the same direction. The car ride was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them felt the need to fill the space, and Aaliyah sat in the back seat of the black SUV with her hands resting loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window as the city shifted around them, streets changing from worn sidewalks and small storefronts to wider avenues lined with glass and steel, and Daniel sat in the front, occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror, not out of suspicion but out of something closer to curiosity, because even now, after everything he had seen and been told, there was something about her still difficult to understand, the way she carried herself without urgency, without expectation, as if none of this altered the path she was already on, and the car slowed as it turned into a private drive, the noise of the city fading behind them, replaced by a controlled quiet that seemed to belong to another world entirely, and ahead the building rose into view, tall and precise, its glass surface reflecting the afternoon light in sharp angles, and Aaliyah did not react, did not shift, she simply watched, taking in the change without judgment, and when the car came to a stop Daniel stepped out first, moving around to open her door, a gesture automatic and practiced, and she stepped out without hesitation, her eyes lifting briefly to take in the height of the building before returning to the ground in front of her, and together they moved toward the entrance, the doors opening smoothly as they approached, revealing a space that felt almost too still, too ordered, polished floors stretching beneath soft lighting, every surface clean, every movement controlled, and as they walked through the lobby people glanced up, their attention drawn not by her presence alone but by the contrast she created, the quiet disruption of something that did not fit into the pattern they were used to, and yet no one spoke, no one questioned, because Daniel's presence was explanation enough, and they continued forward, past the reception desk, past the waiting area where conversations softened as they passed, until they reached the elevator, and the doors slid open with a soft chime, and Aaliyah stepped inside, her reflection faintly visible in the mirrored walls, and for a moment she looked at it, not with recognition, not with doubt, just noticing, and then the doors closed and the elevator began to rise, the numbers lighting up one by one in a steady rhythm, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, less formal than before, "You can leave at any time," and she glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged. "I know," she said, and that was all, and the elevator reached its destination with a quiet pause, the doors opening to a hallway that felt even more removed from the outside world, the air cooler, the silence deeper, and at the end of it a set of double doors stood slightly open, and Daniel gestured toward them, not leading but allowing her to move first, and she did, her step steady as she crossed the threshold, and inside the room was large but not overwhelming, its design simple, deliberate, a wide desk positioned near the far wall, and behind it Jonathan Hale stood, not seated, not working, just standing, as if he had been waiting without moving, and when she entered his gaze lifted immediately, locking onto her with a focus that held no distraction, no hesitation, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the distance between where she stood and where he was becoming the only thing that mattered, and neither of them spoke right away, because there are moments that do not need words to exist, moments that carry their own weight simply by being acknowledged, and Jonathan took a step forward, slow and deliberate, his posture no longer defined by control but by something more careful, more aware, and when he stopped a few feet from her there was a pause, brief but undeniable, before he spoke, his voice steady, but stripped of everything unnecessary. "You saved my son," and it was not a statement meant to impress, not a declaration meant to elevate, it was simply the truth as he saw it, and Aaliyah met his gaze without shifting, without softening, and after a second she nodded once, the same way she had before, simple, direct, and the silence returned, not empty but full, carrying everything neither of them had yet said, and for the first time in that room, in that world of certainty and structure, something unfamiliar settled in the air, something that could not be controlled or predicted, because this was not a transaction, not an exchange, it was something else entirely, something neither of them could fully define yet but both could feel beginning to take shape. The silence held longer this time, not uncertain but deliberate, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would shape everything that followed, and Jonathan Hale took another small step forward, not to close the distance completely but enough to show that he was no longer standing behind anything, not a desk, not a title, just himself, and his voice when he spoke again carried something different now, something quieter. "I have spent my entire life believing that if something mattered, I could fix it," and he paused, not for effect but because the words themselves felt unfamiliar, as if he was hearing them for the first time. Last night proved that is not always true, and Aaliyah watched him without interruption, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, not drawn in, not pushed away, simply present, and he continued, his gaze holding hers, "You did something I could not do," and there was no hesitation in the admission, no attempt to soften it, and for a brief moment the room felt smaller again, not because of space but because of truth, and Aaliyah shifted her weight slightly, her head tilting just enough to acknowledge what he said, and then she answered, her voice calm, even, "You could have," and the words landed differently than expected, not dismissive, not challenging, just matter of fact, and Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, not in disagreement but in reflection. "No," he said quietly, "I was standing there," and she met his gaze without flinching. So was everyone else, and that stopped him, not completely, but enough to make him pause, because she was not separating him from the crowd, not placing him above or below them, just among them, and that realization carried more weight than anything else she could have said, and for a second he looked away, not out of discomfort but because he needed to process it, needed to understand what it meant beyond the surface. And when he looked back at her there was something clearer in his expression, something less guarded, and he asked, "Why did you go in?" And it was not a question of doubt, not disbelief, just a need to understand something that had no obvious answer, and Aaliyah considered it for a moment, her gaze drifting slightly as if searching not for the right words but for the simplest ones, and then she said, "Because he called," and the answer was so direct, so uncomplicated, that it left no space for anything else, no room for explanation or elaboration, and Jonathan let out a slow breath, the weight of that simplicity settling deeper than any complex reasoning ever could, and he nodded once, absorbing it, and then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small envelope, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he understood that what he was about to offer might not be received the way he intended, and he held it out toward her, not pushing it forward, just offering. "This is not payment," he said, his voice steady, "it is support, for whatever you need," and Aaliyah looked at the envelope, then back at him, her expression unchanged, and she did not reach for it, not immediately, not at all, and the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier, and she shook her head once, a small but clear movement, "I do not need that." And Jonathan did not pull his hand back, not right away, as if giving her time to reconsider. But she did not, and after a moment he lowered it slowly, not offended, not surprised, just understanding, and he placed it back inside his jacket without comment, and something shifted again in the room, something that removed the last trace of expectation, leaving only what was real, and he spoke once more, his tone softer now, less certain but more honest, "Then tell me what you do need," and Aaliyah was quiet for a moment, her eyes steady, not searching for advantage, not calculating, just considering, and when she spoke her voice was the same as before, calm, direct, "Nothing from you," and the words did not carry rejection, only truth, and Jonathan stood there, absorbing it, feeling the weight of a world where not everything could be given or taken, where some things simply existed without exchange, and for the first time in that room, in that life he had built, he understood that what she had done could not be measured, could not be balanced, could not be repaid in any way. That made sense to him before, and that realization did not leave him frustrated, it left him quiet, thoughtful, changed in a way he could not ignore, and he nodded slowly, not in agreement but in acceptance, because for the first time, he was not trying to solve the moment, he was trying to understand it, and that alone was something entirely new. The room remained still, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that needed to happen had already been said, and Aaliyah stood there without shifting, her presence unchanged by the weight of the conversation, while Jonathan Hale remained where he was, his posture no longer defined by certainty but by reflection, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there are silences that do not demand to be filled, only understood. And Jonathan let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to her, as if he was choosing his next words more carefully than he ever had before. "Then maybe this is not about what you need," he said quietly, and she did not respond right away, her expression steady, waiting, and he continued, "Maybe it is about what I need to understand," and that shifted something, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that Aaliyah's eyes narrowed slightly in focus, and he took another step, not closer in distance but closer in intent. "I have spent years building things, fixing things, solving problems with numbers, with plans, with control," he said, his voice even but carrying something deeper now, "but last night, none of that mattered," and the admission hung in the air, heavier than before, because this time it was not just acknowledgement, it was realization, and Aaliyah watched him, not with judgment, not with approval, just with attention, and he went on, "You did not hesitate, you did not calculate, you just acted," and she shifted slightly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, and she replied, "It was not about acting," and he paused, listening, and she added, "It was about not walking away," and the words settled between them with a clarity that required no explanation, and Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing it, because that was the difference, not courage, not strength, but choice, a simple decision that separated action from inaction, and he looked at her again, his expression quieter now, more grounded. "Most people would have walked away," he said, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "Most people did, and there was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just truth," and for a moment he looked away again, not out of discomfort but because he needed to carry that truth fully, needed to let it settle without resistance, and when he looked back something had shifted further, something more permanent, and he spoke again, his voice softer but more certain. "I cannot change what happened last night," he said, "but I can decide what happens after it," and Aaliyah remained still, her attention steady, and he continued, "Not for me, not for my company, not for how it looks," and he paused, choosing his next words carefully, "but because I should have been the kind of person who would not walk away," and the admission was simple, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it was not about her anymore, not entirely, it was about him, about who he had been and who he was beginning to understand he could be, and Aaliyah watched him for a long moment, her gaze steady, as if measuring not his words but the space behind them, and then she nodded once, not in agreement, not in approval, just acknowledgement, and she said, "Then do not," and that was all, no instructions, no guidance, just a statement that placed the responsibility exactly where it belonged, and Jonathan stood there, absorbing it, feeling the simplicity of it settle deeper than anything else, because it was not complicated, not something that required strategy or planning, just a choice, repeated again and again, and for the first time in a long time, that felt both unfamiliar and clear, and the room seemed to shift slightly, not in structure but in meaning, as if the space itself had changed along with the conversation, and after a moment Aaliyah stepped back, not abruptly, not to leave, just enough to create distance again, and Jonathan did not stop her, did not reach out, because he understood now that this was not something he could hold on to, not something he could define or control, and as she turned slightly, preparing to leave the way she had entered, he spoke one last time, not to change her mind, not to ask for anything, but because it needed to be said, "You changed something." And she paused briefly, her back still to him, and then she answered without turning around, her voice calm, unchanged, "No," she said, "you did," and with that she continued forward, her step steady, leaving behind a space that no longer felt the same as it had before, and Jonathan remained where he was, standing in the quiet that followed, understanding now that the moment was not about what had been given or taken, but about what had been seen, and what he chose to do with it next. The door closed softly behind her, not with finality but with a quiet certainty that the moment had reached its natural end, and Aaliyah Brooks walked back through the hallway the same way she had entered, her step steady, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about her had shifted despite everything that had just been said, and the elevator doors opened without delay, the space inside reflecting her image once more in faint, fragmented angles, and she stepped in without hesitation, pressing the button for the ground floor with a simple motion that carried no weight beyond itself, and as the doors slid shut the silence returned, not empty but familiar, the kind of silence she understood, the kind that did not ask anything from her, and the elevator began its descent, each floor passing in quiet succession, and she leaned back slightly against the wall, her eyes lowering as if letting the moment settle into something distant, something already behind her, and when the doors opened again she stepped out into the lobby, the same polished space now unchanged, people moving as they had before, conversations continuing without interruption, and no one stopped her, no one called her name, because to them she was just another figure passing through, and she moved toward the exit without pause, the glass doors parting as she approached, letting in the outside air that felt more real, more grounded, and as she stepped onto the sidewalk the city met her again in its usual rhythm, cars passing, voices blending, the world continuing exactly as it always had, and she did not look back, not at the building, not at what she was leaving behind, because for her there was nothing to return to, only the path ahead, and she walked forward, her figure blending into the movement of the street until she became part of it once more, and high above, in a room that now felt different in ways no one else could see, Jonathan Hale remained where she had left him, standing in the quiet space that no longer felt like control but like reflection, and he did not move immediately, did not reach for his phone or return to his work, because for the first time in a long time, there was something more important than the next task, and he turned slowly, his gaze moving toward the window that overlooked the city, the same city he had spent years shaping from a distance, influencing through decisions and numbers and plans, and yet now it looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had, and he stepped closer to the glass, his reflection faintly visible beside the view, and for a moment he simply stood there, taking it in, the movement, the scale, the lives unfolding beyond his reach, and then he spoke quietly, not to anyone else but to himself, "Do not walk away," and the words carried no audience, no expectation, just a commitment formed in the simplest way possible, and he turned from the window then, his movements no longer automatic but intentional. And he reached for his phone, not with urgency but with purpose, dialing a number he had not called in years, and when the line connected his voice was steady, clear. "I want to reopen the community housing project," he said, and there was a pause on the other end, surprise evident even in silence, and he continued before it could be questioned, not as a proposal, not as a discussion, as a decision, and the shift was subtle but undeniable, not in tone but in meaning, because this was not about image or expansion. It was about something else entirely, something rooted in the moment he could not forget, and as he ended the call he did not feel resolution, not yet, but he felt direction, and that was enough, and miles away, beneath the open sky and the ordinary noise of the city, Aaliyah continued walking, her path unmarked, her steps steady, unaware of the changes already beginning to ripple outward from something she had done without expectation, without pause, and though their worlds remained separate, divided by distance and circumstance, they were no longer untouched by each other, because sometimes the smallest decision, the simplest choice to step forward instead of away, does not just change a moment, it changes everything that comes after it, quietly, steadily, in ways that do not need to be seen to be real.